All right, guys, I'm going to address some other questions that were asked regarding how I reviewed questions and if that changed depending on the question type. Absolutely, it changed. It changed depending on the question type. It changed from when I was in week 1 to when I was in weeks 5 or 6 of my step studying. It definitely changed throughout the process. Earlier on, I had more knowledge gaps. I had more weaknesses. So I took more time to address those as they came up while I was doing my questions. And so I would hit those a little harder. And I was reviewing after doing the entire block. I did not do them on tutor mode. I did that earlier on, like January, February, March, when I was dabbling in like RX questions, I would do them on tutor mode. But because you're trying to train your brain to get through a whole block without pooping out on you, I do recommend doing the whole block, doing it timed, and reviewing afterwards. And that might change depending on who you are as a person, right? That's what I recommend and the reasons that I recommend doing that. But if that doesn't work for you, or if you're not as efficient doing that, then maybe you need to change it up. Listen to yourself and be self-aware. You know what works best for you. Let's see, if it's different for different types of questions. When I got questions right, I would only read the UWorld's explanation for the question. I wanted to know why the other answer choices were wrong. I often learned a lot that I didn't even know about the other answer choices when I did this. So that was helpful because I was gaining new knowledge. But I would leave it at that if I got the question right. I did less of this the closer I got to the test because at some point I was doing 120 questions a day and I just didn't have time. Also at that point I was not getting as many questions wrong and I had few knowledge gaps. So I didn't need to do it as in-depth. But definitely at the beginning. For questions that I got wrong, I would do the same thing. I would read the explanation, read the answer choices, figure out why it was that I got that question wrong. Did I second guess myself? Was there a lack of knowledge? Did I misread the question, which I tend to do because I go very quickly through questions. And so I would figure out when and why that was happening, right? I realized that sometimes when the question had a picture or a graph or a table, I would get super distracted by that and end up not fully reading the question stem. So I knew I saw a picture on one of my next questions. I would pause and say, okay, look at the picture, but go back and read the question stem carefully. And so you get an idea of those types of things as you go through, as long as you're being mindful when you're doing the questions and not just doing them for the sake of getting through the questions or doing them just to see if you got them right or wrong or to see what your percentage was. Like, you should be utilizing each question to really get to the bottom of where your knowledge gaps are, where your test taking gaps are, and finding out ways to fill those. So it definitely changed depending on the type of question or questions based off of where I knew my knowledge gaps lied. So if I got a question wrong and it was in a subject where I had a lower percentage, for example, like I mentioned previously, for me, renal, I had lower scores than my other subjects. So for renal questions, if I had gotten it wrong, I took extra time. I would read the answer choices, reread the question sum, figure out why I got it wrong, read the explanation, and then maybe I'd go watch a video on renal physiology or whatever it was that that question was based on. And just take that extra time because I knew that it was somewhere where I had a deficit. So again, this is a fluid process. It's going to change over time. You're going to need more content study in certain areas and less in others, and you're going to need more early on and less later on. Another important thing is just to go with your gut. Over time, you'll notice sometimes, like even now, I do MBME questions. It's been, over a year since I took STEP. No, about a year since I took STEP. And I'll read a question and I'll be like, I know that B is the answer. Like, it's definitely the answer, but I don't know if I could tell you why. Your brain, without you realizing sometimes, picks up on patterns and it picks up on subtle information. And so it's important to go with your gut, okay? That's definitely something that you want to listen to throughout this process. What else did I want to mention? When you're doing your practice exams, I don't know if the question banks have the pharmaceutical ads or the research questions where it's like 2-part questions and they're really long. I highly recommend even starting now in your practice exams, those and like epi questions that require calculations, pick an answer, mark them, and do them at the end. Just trust me on this one. Even if you do well on these questions on the day, on test day, they seem very overwhelming and very time consuming, and it can cause you, if you have it in the beginning or in the middle, you'll feel like you have less time even when you don't really have less time. So if you just mark them and put them at the end, you know exactly how much time you can spend on them, because it's usually a little bit more than the 90 seconds per question. You'll know how much time you have, you'll already have an answer chosen, and that'll allow you to spend that time properly rather than spending time that you might not have by the time you get to the end of the block if you do them earlier on. So I wanted to mention that. I was also asked a question, regarding ethics questions, which I had a hard time with a little bit at the beginning too, right? Obvious, some of them are obvious, like don't punch your patient, be nice to them, and just kind of do whatever seems to be the most politically correct thing to do. But there are some ethics questions that are really tough. I will say that there is an ethics section in the public health science section of first aid. So if you find yourself having a hard time with these questions, I definitely recommend, I recommend for everyone to read that section, because it's going to give you some principles and some concepts to follow when you're doing those questions. The other thing I will say, don't worry too much about it, because at the end of the day, you're going to see so many of these scenarios in your practice questions, and there's only really so many scenarios that they can give you in questions. So you'll feel comfortable with it by the time you take your exam. But again, for me, that was also a tough section. I would get caught between two really similar answers. But reading that section will definitely help you, and doing the questions in New World for those will definitely help you. I think that's all for the questions I've gotten so far. There might have been one more. Okay, what is the best way to content review, and which I already covered, right? Content reviewing, the content that I used, the resources I used, and the fact that you should use resources that have worked for you before, that you're familiar with, and I think that covers that. So let me know if you guys have any other questions, topics you want me to cover, things you want me to talk about. You guys are going to do great. Don't stress out. Take it one day at a time. Take breaks. Take time to relax, okay? You're training your brain for a brain marathon, and you can't train 7 days a week all the time and be at 100%. So take some time, relax, read a book, go outside, exercise, just keep on trucking.